I'm Nat, and I'm from an organization called Exceptional Individuals. And essentially, we support people who are neurodiverse. So, dyslexic, dyspraxic, autistic, ADHD, as well as all the other ones. What are the early signs of autism? Mainly because it can be quite difficult to understand, like, when are you diagnosed? It's quite difficult to know the early signs of autism because there's a lot of overlap between children just being children and developing. People often get quite worried about, I don't want to diagnose someone if they don't have it because it can set like a bar or expectations. Today, we are absolutely not about just teaching you to diagnose children. It's just about understanding the signs and characteristics and also the likelihood. So, for example, if there's a sibling who has autism, the younger child is 20% more likely than the average population to also have autism. So you can kind of work out the likelihood that they might be autistic and then go find a professional. I was diagnosed at 3 or 4, and 4 is the average age to be diagnosed. But does that mean you can't have autism before 4? No, you definitely can, and you do. But how do you spot it? Now, I mentioned a bit about what we do, but as we've got some new attendees, we're based in the UK, but we do work worldwide. But essentially, we help people who are neurodiverse get high-end employment. We help organizations become more inclusive. And we used to just support people who were neurodiverse, but more and more we're finding parents who are getting interested in the subject because it's hereditary, which means autism runs in the family, it's genetic. The likelihood is if your child has autism, you very well could have autism yourself. You're not guaranteed to have autism, but it's a really good way to start that discussion and find out if it's something which is in the realms of possibility. Now, early signs of autism. And as mentioned, most people are diagnosed at 4. That's like the average age. But can you notice the signs earlier on? And are they different to just a child being a child? Well, yeah. But a quick disclaimer that ASD is really, really unique to every individual. So just because you have some of the characteristics or symptoms that I mentioned does not mean you have autism, but also if you have none of these, you could also be autistic. Annoyingly, it's not that black and white, which would be handy, but that's just not the case. So do keep that in mind. Now, how to answer these questions? Because I appreciate we don't actually have any babies in the group. So if you are a parent or an auntie or you know a child in your life, I want you to answer about how they are like now, like just their mannerisms. If you are a lot older, I want you to answer these questions how they used to be or from your own perspective. So yes, the questions are going to be talking pretty much like, did your child do this? But if you didn't have a child, you can still very much answer, but you have to change it a bit in your head so it makes sense.
The previous slide, your previous slide.
Yeah.
Why there only parent, and other? Don't have one option that say autistic adult?
Because for this session, it was mainly focusing on babies, and I guess I thought we're not going to have people of that age attend, but you are right. So I would say on this, answer the questions on how you remember yourself being or how your parents told you that you were at a young age, if you had any insights. But we're going to start off with social differences between people who developed conventionally and those who developed in an alternative way to the mainstream of this population. Now on here, you'll see a picture of a woman, and I want you to just put a dot where you think a child would naturally look.
Do people with autism like the same food? Can they be like repetitive? Like, for example, you like healthy food and you like porridge every morning. But if you tell people you like porridge every morning and it's a set way you eat it, the same thing, other times people think that's so boring. But for you, could that be like, I'm happy with that?
That is 100% an autistic quality. This sense of repetition, it's comforting. It's been documented for over 100 years now, people who have what we would now call autism. For me, I eat Shruggies every single day forever. And if I don't have that set routine, it can be really disruptive. It doesn't have to be healthy food, though. Like, for instance, when I was younger, I would only eat McDonald's. Really, really unhealthy, but I just wouldn't eat anything else. So the repetitiveness could be anything. It doesn't have to be one set thing. And on this one, I asked you to put a pin where you think a child would naturally look while you are talking to them. And as you can guess, most of you put it towards the eyes, because the eyes are the window to the soul, but typically that's what we consider good communication. But those with autism will not genuinely like making eye contact. So it's a really good way to know that, say if your child or infant just isn't making eye contact with you in a way that you would suspect. And the key thing is, because a lot of the time we think children with autism are ignoring us on purpose when they're not. They just find it very discomforting to kind of like lock eye contact. This is the most stereotypical one. So this is the one you've probably heard of before, but this is a really good classic sign to start off with. Just because someone can't make eye contact, again, doesn't mean they're autistic. And just because you can make eye contact, it works both ways. The next one is about facial expressions. So, when you're like looking at a child and you go like peekaboo, or, you make a funny face at it, do they kind of respond? How do they kind of react? So it might be that they find everything hilarious. They might be a complete like deadpan face. There might be no interest whatsoever. And this kind of still goes on with the eye contact thing. Those with autism typically will not respond in a way that you would expect them to respond. So for instance, if you do a smiley face, you would expect the kid to also smile or to laugh. But someone with ASD will typically not give you those characteristics. They typically will just not be interested, or they'll just seem like not engaged. And this is, again, a really good sign when people are, I would say, within the first year of their life, because there is obviously a developmental phase. So we're going to be looking at the first 12 months and 18 months and 24 months. But this does tend to be in the first year. The next is not just about facial expressions, but also gestures and hands. So if you point at an object, where would the child look? So let's say I was pointing at my phone. Would the child look at the phone? Would they look away from the phone? Or would they just not really register and just continue looking where they were before? I can see we've got a nice broad range here. And a child who has developed in the more traditional sense will look at the object. It's kind of an inbuilt instinct where you point at something and the person will follow the finger to the object that is being shown. You don't really need to teach a child to do that. They just know it. But someone with autism, they don't have that kind of set of instructions. Just because you point to something or do a body language, it doesn't really mean anything. It's because the brain is like lacking the communication. It needs additional information to put the two together. They might not even change directions, like, okay, I don't know why you're pointing at anything, and ignore you. Or they might look away because they might find it quite awkward to follow that gaze and not want to. We don't really know why children act the way they act, but we do know that those who, for instance, show these characteristics early on do tend to be diagnosed later in life. And the sooner you can get diagnosed, the better. Why? Because unfortunately, there is a massive link between mental health challenges and autism. They're not the same thing, but if you don't get the support and the strategies in place early on, eventually it is going to wear you down. So it's much better to at least know at the beginning. The next one is about affection. So my child, and again, answer it from whatever perspective you have, has appropriate facial expressions. So if they fall over, I want to see a sad face. If you give them a cake, you want to see a smile. Those are the facial expressions you would imagine. Next one is difficulty knowing what others are thinking. So do you think if you're sad, would the child know that you are being sad, or would they not register? Or if you're laughing, would they understand that you are in a happy mood? These things to those who are neurotypical seem like second nature, but those with autism, it's like they have to learn these ways of processing the world from day one. I always saw it, for myself at least, being about 2 years behind my peers. I absolutely was able to learn facial expressions and empathy and making friends, but it did take me longer than the average person. April says, I tend to answer these questions from my own perspective and when I was a child. I think that's a really good way of doing it, April, particularly if you don't have children. And also making friends. So what we got here, disagree, has appropriate facial expressions. Yep, people with autism or children, babies, are not going to give you the expression you expect. Because again, it's something which is developing in the child, why it's called a developmental disorder. It takes time for that to be kind of embedded in the brain. We often talk about nature v nurture, and with autism, it definitely is a combination. But a lot of the time it is nature. So it is something which is like pre-programmed in you, or things that you have to learn along the way. We've got difficulty knowing what others are thinking. Okay, that's a very mixed one. Likes to show empathy. So empathy is if someone is sad, you also show a sadness to show that you are connecting. Very much a challenge with those with autism. Not because we are less empathetic than anyone else, but because we show it in a different way, and has difficulty making friends. Well, autism, I think, is a Greek word. It might be no, I think it's Greek, and it means alone. So the very original definition of autism was being someone who prefers being inward facing and prefers their own company. So that's not surprising either. So a quick summary of these points is that those with autism will typically struggle or make very little eye contact. I always want to be a bit careful on this one because I think this is over stereotyped way too much, but it is a very key characteristic, particularly when a child is nonverbal or haven't developed speech at this point. They're less receptive to facial expressions, so it feels like they're in their own little world. Like you could be, trying to make it laugh, smile, and you were getting nothing back. Another thing is that if you point to an object like, hey, look over there, look at the cat, and they are not looking, or maybe trying to get their attention. And another thing which is quite interesting is bringing things of interest. Now, this applies more to children as they get a little bit older, but like when you're proud of something, you always run up to your parents and say, hey, look at this, look what I've got. Some with autism will typically not feel as inclined to show off. They won't give you a toy and say, hey, look at my toy. No, they're not bothered. They're very much happy with their own self. And sometimes parents can get quite sad about this because they feel like, well, they hate me. They're not connecting. Your kid doesn't hate you. It's just the way that they show interest is different to the way that you show interest. And I think the more we know about autism, the better, because when people act different to how we expect them to act, we make assumptions based on our own viewpoint. So for instance, if I smile at someone and someone does not smile back, because for me, smiling is a sign of happiness and acceptance, I'm going to assume that the other person does not like me. But with autism, think of it like a different language, and sometimes things can get lost in communication. So by understanding that, maybe it can help us not take things to heart so much. There is no guidebook to being a parent, and there's definitely no guidebook to being a parent of an autistic child. I wish there was, but it really is something you have to learn along the way. Now, the next section I want to look at is communication differences in children with autism. So how do they communicate? And how is it different to others who are not autistic? The question I want to ask you is that at what age did they first say a two-word phrase? Now, if you are autistic yourself, answer this from your own perspective. But essentially, when did they first start talking? And when I say talking, I don't mean just like dada, mama. It's got to have like multiple words. So like, hey, how are you? Or good. Something that at least has two words or phrases. Okay, we've got 22 months. Nice. Over the age of 2. And you'll notice typically this will be a delay. People with autism do struggle with communication in the conventional sense. Like I said, I've always been about 2 years behind my peers, and I think I learned to speak fluidly-ish at 5, which is really late. And people were very concerned. They're like, oh dear. But it does eventually pick up. It's just like the brain is slowly like putting the building blocks together. Where those who aren't autistic, kind of like I said, it comes second nature. People with autism, it's like they have to learn it from scratch. They absolutely can do it, but it is going to take longer for their brain to put all the building blocks together. So we're moving on now, we're getting a little bit older. And between 15 and 24 months, so within 1 year of a child being born, have you seen any signs of regression? So these are things they could do, but could no longer do. And I think this is a really interesting one. So we're not saying that they could never do it, but at one point, let's say they were able to put a sentence together and now they can no longer do it. Or they were showing interest in certain things, or they were making eye contact and now they can't do it. April says, when I was 2 years old, the first phrase with more than one word my mum can remember me saying is Shoe People video. The Shoe People was a cartoon from the late 80s and early 90s where shoes came to life as shoe people. I have not heard of that, but that sounds interesting. So far we've got potty training. Yep, though that's a really kind of classic one, to be honest. Now, why there is this regression? I think the jury is still out. We don't really know. But it is definitely interesting that you might kind of like seemingly make progress and then it can kind of go backwards. And this can be quite concerning to a lot of parents, are like, what is happening? But it is very normal to kind of go back and forth because the brain is still developing, growing, it's changing directions. Think of the brain like there's like neural pathways, so like little wires that are going all over the place. And when you're younger, the wires are continuously moving in order to find the best direction possible. So it's very possible that at one stage things are working seemingly fine, but then it will kind of like redirect and like rewire it. And as a result, things can kind of get lost. Dole says, apparently I was a chatty patty and then stopped around 2 to 3, told it was the trauma of an ill brother being born, of a little brother being born. I mean, yeah, that could work as well. Sometimes differences in your surroundings, maybe a traumatic event, maybe a little brother being born, something can kind of disrupt the pattern of someone's progression. So not surprising, to be honest. But I appreciate this is a difficult question to answer. The next, we're talking about sensory information. We all know when it comes to autism, people can struggle with certain non-verbal types of communication. And you normally expect, if you say, hi, mate, you expect someone to say, hi, mate, back. But with someone with autism, they may not respond in the way that you expect. And this also applies to children. So let's say there's a child sat on the sofa and you say, hey, Brian. Are they going to respond? Or if there's a car boop, boop, outside, will they look out the window? A cat meowing? Or do they not respond at all? And I think for humans, we're naturally curious. If we hear like a horn or a siren, we tend to look because we're curious about what it is. It could also be a survival mechanism to understand what's going on in our surrounding. But those with autism typically will not respond, or they'll show a lot less interest. A good one is name. So you expect when you say your child's name, it'll be one of the first words or phrases that they kind of like their ears prick up and they're like, okay, I know that refers to me. But it's very common for those with autism to not respond. They don't kind of like resonate or kind of like join together that word or phrase results to someone talking about them. It is not them ignoring you. One thing that happens quite often is parents will go to the doctors and say, I think my child has a hearing condition. I think they're struggling understanding. And that's not the case at all. As far as I'm aware, there's no link between autism and poor hearing. It's just how the brain is not really registering it. Interesting, Carhorn. I mean, for instance, I was very, very particular. So my name is Nathaniel, and if you did not say my name completely correct, I was not listening to you. So if someone says Nathan, even though someone who was not autistic would very clearly understand and be sympathetic that maybe someone pronounced my name wrong, but they were referring to me, I wasn't talking to them. I was like, you did not say my exact name. I am not listening. And again, it's not being rude. It's not kind of being stubborn. It's that the rules are more black and white, rather than knowing that, okay, it could be Nathaniel, Nathan, Nat, Nate, Ndog. For me, it was very much yes or no. If you do not use this phrase, there. But a child who is still kind of understanding that this name refers to them might struggle. And we often like to give kids little pet names. So I don't know, like Thomas, we might call Tommy, or like kind of change the names, or like Tom Tom. And that can be quite confusing, particularly while the child is still kind of like connecting the dots between that word equals my name. Okay, moving on to a really disturbing gif of a ridiculously brainy duck. How true are these statements? The child/infant ... So on here, you just need to rate, is this true or not? So you might go like 5 for really true or 1 for not true at all. So did your child or yourself, if you're putting yourself in that perspective, have a good memory? Were they good at remembering where things were placed? Did they enjoy pretend play? So, going in their own little world. Would they voluntarily start a conversation with you or you with others, or show interest in communicating? Now, people with autism do tend to have a good memory, but that doesn't mean that it's like a good memory overall. So you know how there's like short-term memory and long-term memory? You typically tend to be really good in one area, but the other one might be significantly lower. I have a pretty good long-term memory, I would say, but my short-term memory is god-awful. I can't remember anything. Pretend play, I think this varies. People with autism might struggle pretend playing, and it makes sense, to be honest, because we know there is a link between empathy, which is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. It stands to reason that someone with autism might struggle with pretending, because all pretending is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And it's a really important skill to learn early on. Another thing with autism is that children may respond if you talk to them, but that doesn't mean that they're going to go out of their way to start a conversation. For them, they don't see the need to. So it's really interesting to know, did you start a conversation, or are you more likely to be reactive or responsive? So reactive is when you go out your way to talk to someone, and responsive is when you only reply when spoken to. But do remember, really, really key to remember, that none of these guarantee autism or a diagnosis, but what they do equal is a higher likelihood that you may have autism and that you might want to explore this a little bit further. Behavior differences in children with autism. So are children with autism more of a handful? Are they more difficult to be around?
I've got a nephew who's autistic, but he's different. He's very different, but yeah, you find him different. He's more reserved. Yeah. Like I say, he keeps themselves to himself. They're not very interactive and like the rest of the kids, and that you normally expect kids to be.
Oh, no, that's interesting. And that actually brings me on to another really interesting point, the difference between male and female, because we talk about children with autism, are they more difficult? Well, they can be, but also they can be more reserved and introverted. Typically, boys are more likely to be autistic than females, statistically. And that's not because they are more likely, it's because they're more likely to demonstrate it in a more outward facing way, so more disruptive, where females tend to be more quieter and more passive. And we've spoken about this many, many times before, but when they create the criteria for are you or are you not ASD, it was created for males. And as a result, a lot of females aren't going to get picked up. And it's because they don't get that recognition early on. There is unfortunately a link between people, females and girls, struggling with mental health more severely as they get older with autism. So we're all about communication, but there's multiple ways to communicate. It's not just verbal. So with people with autism, it's not like they don't want to communicate, but the way they communicate is going to be different to, say, you or me if you do not have autism. So I want to say, did you as a child, or say your nephew, niece, your child, whoever, did they ever do any of the following? You know, flap their hands, walk on toes for a long time, you know, like kind of like tipping toe, or like sway about, or maybe just like rocking forward? So whether or not it's hands flapping, swaying, rocking, walking on your tiptoes, essentially, if it feels good, they will do it. And it's why people with autism do this thing called stimming, where they'll just kind of like move their body in a way. And it's like, it's them expressing themselves. Like, and I do, like, sometimes I'll just go around the house and go, meow. Or I often sit on my chair like that. Genuinely, I sit on my tiptoes. Why? I just find it more comfortable, or for me, it works. Is it socially unacceptable? Well, yes, it is. But if I'm in a position where no one's going to know, who really cares? And the same thing is very true with kids. They do things because they want to, because it feels good, because it's a way of them communicating in a way which naturally works for them. Okay, next one is some children with ASD, so autism spectrum disorder, may not cry if in pain or seem to show no fear. And this really goes in back to people with autism do not demonstrate things in the way that we would expect. So typically, if a kid falls over, you want to see tears, but someone with autism might fall over, nothing. And you're like, how are you not upset right now? Or they might just be like just a little bump and might be floods of tears. So pain threshold, again, it's not that you can't feel pain, you absolutely can, but you might show it in a different way. We're still kind of undecided why we cry or why kids cry. One side, it's a form of attention.
I don't know, my nephew, when he cries and wants his mummy, he won't stop crying. His cries endless, and it's very hard work.
Yeah, and like endless tears. I think we're still we're still really learning why people cry. I mean, there's a few reasons. One, it's a sign that we know if we cry, it's a form of communication of getting someone else's attention. So it stands to reason that someone with a communication developmental disorder like autism isn't going to cry in the same way. They either might not do it at all, or they might not know when it's the appropriate time to stop. There's also research that by crying, it releases like a chemical, which kind of it like naturally reduces pain. So that's kind of interesting as well, why the brain might not necessarily do that in the same way. I also got general fears. Those with autism might be absolutely fearless to their own detriment. So let's say, you know, the oven is still hot. They might just try like walking over it, or there's like sharp things on the floor. They won't have the same general awareness of dangers. So really interesting. And another good characteristic, you think at this age, they should know that that's a bad thing to do. Like say there's like, they're in their bedroom and there's like a fan, and other kids would stick their finger in the fan, ouch, hurts, they wouldn't do it again. But someone with autism might keep doing it. And it's just because the way that the brain develops, knowing what is the correct way of communicating, what is dangerous, what is safe, is delayed, naturally being a delayed developmental disorder. And you'll notice that those with autism, it is a lifelong condition. But during the early years, this is when the brain is still growing, developing, it's kind of molding itself. So I'm not saying that adults are going to be sticking their fingers in fans, but there will be a difference in how they express the world. People with autism can absolutely learn to be neurotypical, but they're not really typical. They're doing this thing called masking. And masking is where you act like everyone else in society in order to blend and fit in. That is tiring and that can result in mental health issues. But as adults, we do that. Children, on the other hand, will not do masking because for them, there's no negatives to not conforming. They haven't been conditioned to do that yet. So on this one, I want you to rank how sensitive either you or your child was growing up. So for instance, if you were really sensitive to sound, you'd move it to a 1. If you just didn't really feel or touch anything, move it to a 4. And again, is there a particular link? Like, are autistic people more likely to be sensitive to sound or smell? No, but they are more likely to be sensitive in one particular area. It's why some children, like if you hear a bang, they will just overreact. Or if a dog barking, they will cry till they're blue in the face. And you're like, why are you still crying? The dog barked ages ago. Or it might be if the lights turn on and it's very distressing. Think of like all these symptoms as being kind of exaggerated or more intense. And this is really useful to know because let's say if you can smell something a bit bad in your house, it could be even worse for the autistic child. Or if you think, oh, these lights are a bit bright, just imagine it being even more bright. And that might explain why sometimes their reactions don't seem proportionate. It's not because they are lying and making it up, but it's because they experience the world in a more, I don't know, intense or enhanced way to maybe yourself. Interestingly, I see a lot of you said sound, and sound is a common one. I used to have to wear big ear masks. So whenever I'd go out or like fireworks, I know it was very distressing. This is why noise cancelling headphones are often recommended. Lights.
I think for me, I think mine is sound as well. I mean, if I'm on the bus and I see a child crying and it's non-stop crying, it can be very annoying until it stops. It's like the ambulance fire alarms.
Yeah, there's certain things. I think for me, when the sound, it's, you know, like the sound of like a chalkboard, like that can just like really cringe. Or for me, the texture of foam, like if I touch it, I just kind of like, I'm like a slug. I just like curl up. There's certain things which I find I'm more sensitive to. They definitely have gotten less the older I've gotten. But when I was younger, it's that I didn't respond to certain stimuli how you would imagine. And it was very difficult for my parents because they had to think, okay, so we're going to the zoo. Well, there's going to be noises. We're going to have to wear ear masks. There's going to be lots of different touches. So we're going to have to put gloves on him. The smells are going to be quite bad. So maybe put a mask on. Oh, he's autistic. He probably doesn't like wearing the mask. You know, there's a lot more things you have to take in consideration. And if you struggle with speaking or you're a child and you haven't learned to speak yet, these things can be extra difficult. Moving sharply on, how strongly do these relate? So on these, I just want you to say whether or not you think, I strongly disagree, this isn't the case whatsoever, or 100% bang on the money. So did you as a child, or your child, whoever you're referring to, did they like routines, like order, like rituals? Very common for those with autism. They like repetition, things that are which the rest of us might find a bit mundane. So if they, for instance, like doing the same thing again and again, maybe a great example is they're absolutely obsessed with a TV show. And even though they've seen the episode 10 quadrillion times and you are sick to death of it, for them, they still get enjoyment out of it and would rather not watch anything else. They may be obsessed with a few or unusual activities. For instance, when I was younger, I had lots of like fun toys, but I'd always play with sticks and stones. They didn't break my bones, but it's things that you're like, well, this wasn't designed for you to get enjoyment out of it, but somehow you are still getting enjoyment out of it.
My brother, he's 42 and he likes Terminator. The family, as a family, we understand that we are sick and you know what's going to happen next. it's not interesting anymore. Why do you want to keep watching it? And it's like, it's not, you're a big boy now, you're still watching Terminator. My dad doesn't understand.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? It's like there's something comforting about knowing what's going to happen. It's different because a lot of us, we like variety, but those with ASD might prefer that kind of same old. Another thing which I found quite interesting in is if you ever got like a toy or whatever, and the child seems more interested in the box, for example, or the thing which they should be playing with, they actually find enjoyment in another part, so maybe like part of the toy rather than all of it. And it just relates to the fact that they are interested in what they're interested in, and they're not getting enjoyment out of what the world that brought them up expects them to get enjoyment out of. So for instance, if you had like a little action man, you would expect the child to play with that, where someone with autism might only want to play with a little helmet that comes with it, because for some reason they find that more interesting, really normal. Also might have unusual vision or glare. So let's say they've got a teddy bear, cuddling the teddy bear. You would expect their eye contact to be locked with that teddy bear, but they might be looking in another direction. Again, really common. And these are all good signs, which means the person may have ASD, and it would be worth getting a second opinion. You really shouldn't be self-diagnosing your child. Trust me, that isn't going to go down well. Autism is really complex. And even though I'm simplifying it today, none of us are qualified to diagnose it. I think it's important to understand the characteristics and then go to a doctor and say, these are things that I've noticed. Do you think it's worth investigating this a little bit further? And the last one we're going to do today, I believe at least, is how to distinguish a child with autism from other typical developing children. As we mentioned, children, they do act different to the rest of us. They are growing, they are developing. So how can you honestly tell if, say, one child isn't making eye contact, are they autistic, or do they just not want to make eye contact? This can be quite difficult. And though I told you not to self-diagnose people, it is still useful to at least be aware of the signs and the things that you might want to look out for. So at 12 months, so that's 1 year old, a child with typical developmental will turn their heads as you say their name. So at 1 year old, you would expect a baby to at least look at you when you say, hey, Brian. I don't know why the baby's called Brian, but you would expect the child to at least acknowledge their name. Also, a child with ASD might not turn to look even after their name is repeated several times, but will respond to other sounds. In many ways, a child with autism is like a cat. Hear me out on this. When you say the name like Jess, and that they can hear, but they don't look at you. Very same with autism. So it might be that, they might respond to a clap, they might respond to clicks or like any other sound, but they haven't formed that relationship with their name. And they will, but it takes time to build that relationship up. We aren't born with a name. A name is something we are given. So ultimately it's something we have to learn and connect with ourselves. And those with autism do struggle with theory of self, being able to understand that their experiences are their experiences and others are others. And a name is kind of a complex thing, really, when you think deep into it. Moving on to 18 months. So this is a little bit over a year. A child with delayed speech skills will point gestures or use facial expressions to make up for their lack of talking. So you would not expect at 18 months, they might probably not talk yet, but they will be pointing to things. They will be finding other ways of communicating. So the child is actively wanting to communicate. They actively want to get their views and opinions across. Those with autism, though, aren't going to be doing that. They come across like they're just not there. As my mum would say, the lights are on, but nobody's home. They absolutely are home. They just don't want to answer the door. A child with ASD might attempt to compensate for delayed speech by repeating words they've heard on TV. So this is called echolalia, I think, where essentially like a parrot. Children love mimicking. You know, they say monkey see, monkey do, or don't do that, the child will copy you. It's really common. It's the way that we learn. If someone swears, a child will swear because they're copying, and that's how we learn. Those with autism, though, typically will not copy. If you say a sound, they will not say the sound back. So there's this kind of like unspoken rule that you say something, you say it back to me. People with autism will not do it. Again, it goes back. So at 18 months, you would expect a child to respond to your interaction with them. They might not be able to comprehend it, but they will be able to like relay it back to you. A child with ASD probably won't do that. And it might seem like they're not developing at the correct rate, which you would expect. Moving on, though, to 2 years old, and look at that little cat gif, it's adorable. So at 2 years old, the child has grown a lot has changed. And typically, they want to share with you. So not just respond to emotions, but show. So maybe if they've got something to show, like, hey, look at this worm I found in the garden, they want to show their joy and share it with others. They're learning to have this kind of relationship with other people. People with autism may not want to. Maybe they've built a lovely Lego house. They are quite happy keeping that house themselves. They don't necessarily want to share. They don't feel they need to give that experience to someone else. Also, a child with autism might, let's say they have like a bottle of bubbles and they like blowing them. They're not that interested in participating with others. And what we normally like to do, like let's say if we're showing off to someone, like, hey, look how high I can jump. We like to look at people's facial expressions to kind of like gain what they are thinking about us. People with autism, let's say they come up to you and they want to show you like, hey, look at this dinosaur. They won't necessarily make eye contact with you because for them, it's just not on their radar in order to like process the other person's reactions. All these things really overlap. They overlap to communicating. We expect people to understand these unspoken rules of communicating. But with those with autism, it is like we have to learn these skills from scratch. And the older you get, the easier it is to learn these skills. But when you're younger, it's just, how do you verbalize that? You can't. So here are some top tips. If you are concerned about your child, there's a few things you can do. You can talk with your pediatrician. If you're not sure what that is, it's someone who specializes in occupational therapy, developmental conditions, speech therapy, but you can also just go to your general GP. Honestly, it's better to be safe than sorry. There's nothing wrong with autism, but the early years are absolutely paramount in making sure that the person develops and grows in the correct way for them. Raquel said, my niece is 13. She would give short answers when talking to her, but she is very good with computers. She can use 2 computers at the same time. Nice, show off. And that is, people with autism are not, they're not dumb or stupid. They're actually really intelligent. But the way that they demonstrate that intelligence doesn't conform to the rest of society's understanding of intelligence. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. There's something that I think you should check out. And if you're ever like not sure whether or not you need to go to your GP, because let's face it, it can be difficult getting an appointment with a doctor. They aren't always experts. A good starting point is just to go online and search developmental milestone checklist. And we've gone through a lot of those checklists today. I just made them a bit more digestible. But essentially, it's a list of all the kind of key signs that at this age, you would expect your child to be able to do this. At this age, you would expect that. And you can kind of tick where they are. If you think that your child isn't hitting a lot of them, then worth investigating. Do not stick by these guidelines as a complete gospel, because we're all different. Some of us might learn to read a bit earlier than others. Others might take a little bit longer. Having that difference is absolutely normal. But if these things are like way off, so if someone is like getting to like 2 years old and isn't saying a single word, well, maybe that's something you might want to look into. Again, not because there's anything wrong with being autistic, but because if you have the support early on, their life becomes so much easier because that you can at least make sure there is help available. And it's easier to get diagnosed earlier on. Like I said, 4 is about the average age. Afterwards, it becomes more difficult due to a whole heap of reasons like funding, awareness, etc. Next is seek a second opinion. Autism is a developing area. We still don't understand it. And if you speak to one person, they might say, no, you don't have autism. You speak to someone else, they might say you do. If you are convinced that there is something going on, it's always worth seeking a second opinion. Science has come a really long way. And actually, if you understand the criteria, if you are a professional and you know what you're looking for, diagnosing autism early on is actually pretty straightforward. We have very strict criteria. However, if these criteria aren't properly understood, it can be very easy to misdiagnose. Autism on its own is one thing, but knowing that you're more likely to have comorbidity, so you're more likely to have another condition, like you might have, I don't know, like schizophrenia, Tourette's, depression, anxiety, all these other things which kind of come along with autism for the ride do make it more challenging to know what is autism and what is not. And if you seek someone who might not be completely specialized in the area, they might mistake one of these other qualities or characteristics as autism, and the child might get the support with the wrong support, which isn't best suited for them. So yeah, I know you might feel a bit naggy or a bit of a complainer, but trust me, there's nothing wrong with getting a second opinion. And the last thing is act early. The sooner you get support, the absolute better. At EI, we're always talking about people who are diagnosed later in life. And, you know, they go through so much challenges and difficulties, which just didn't have to be the case. If you can get it spotted earlier on, you can get the right support in school, you can do the right adjustments, you can teach them in a way that works for them. And autism on itself isn't really an issue, but it's the baggage that comes with autism. It's thinking against the grain. It can give you mental health issues. It can give you anxiety, challenges with depression. It's those are the things that we really want to nip in the bud early on. And that can only happen if there is this awareness that, okay, my child has this way of processing the world. Maybe I'll try teaching them in this way, rather than the way which all the books and other parents say is the correct method. Hopefully that makes sense. So just to summarize, there is support for adults available. For children, it's easy to get diagnosed, but it is a challenge. There's a reason why autistic mums are absolute heroes, also autistic dads. But I just want to throw it back to all of you. Do you have any questions whatsoever when it comes to children, developmental autism, anything along those lines?
Autism, I'm referring to my nephew, he's in a daydream. But I think that's part of autism. You say to wander off into your thoughts like a daydreamer.
Yeah, I think interesting because daydreaming and pretend play seem quite similar, but we know people with autism will kind of not like show pretend play, but it might be because pretend play is an outward facing thing. So you expect someone to, like, you know, play dress up or whatever, but daydreaming is more an internal way. So interesting, but yeah, I think there is a link. Okay, well, if that's all the questions we have today, a bit of a different one that we wouldn't normally do, but I hope you found it interesting to learn about the early stages of autism rather than just the adult side. Next week, though, we're completely changing focus and we're going to do dyscalculia in pop culture. If you've attended any of our pop culture sessions before, these are a much more lighter-hearted, funner approach to learning about neurodiversity. And it's about learning about how does the media show difference. Dyscalculia, if you do not know, it's like dyslexia, but rather than being about language and words, it's about numbers, patterns, symbols, those things. So we're going to be looking about how has the media shown difficulties in maths. Spoiler, it's not been particularly positive. we've always been seen as the butt of all jokes, of people who kind of makes like these silly mistakes. But we're going to be looking at film, TV, media, plays, books, comics, everything. And it is important because our main job at EI is changing opinions and giving awareness to different ways of thinking. And like it or not, we are very influenced by the mass media. So at least understanding how it has been represented before, maybe, just maybe, we can input how it will be represented in the future. So do check that out if you're able to. And as always, feel free to get in contact. If there's anything we said today and you're like, damn, that sounds just like me, get in contact with us. I'm not saying we can, but we might be able to help or at least point you in the right direction. So yeah, thanks everyone for attending. And I hope you have a really great rest of your Thursday, whatever place in the world you are, and catch you next week, hopefully.